There are questions people ask casually that end up unlocking emotions they were never prepared to confront. And recently, your soulmate may have been asked one of those questions about you. It sounded simple enough. What do you miss most about them? But the moment they heard it, something inside them shifted. They may have expected to give an easy answer, something harmless that wouldn't reveal too much. Maybe they thought they would mention your smile, your voice, your sense of humor, or one of those little habits they used to notice without thinking. But instead, their mind went somewhere much deeper. A memory appeared that they hadn't consciously visited in a long time, and suddenly, the answer became harder to control. Imagine someone opening an old drawer, looking for something completely unrelated, only to discover a photograph they thought they had thrown away. They don't just see the picture, they remember the entire moment surrounding it. That may be what happened emotionally when someone asked your soulmate about you. For a second, the walls they had built around the past became thinner. And perhaps what surprised them most was realizing that they still missed something about you they never admitted mattered that much. Maybe it was the way you made ordinary moments feel meaningful. Maybe it was how easily you understood what they were trying to say, even when they couldn't find the right words. Maybe it was the strange comfort of knowing that someone genuinely noticed them. But here's where this becomes much more interesting. Their answer may have revealed more than nostalgia. It may have exposed a feeling they have carefully avoided naming. Because when someone asks what you miss most, the first answer isn't always the deepest answer. Sometimes the real emotion hides underneath it. And your soulmate may have accidentally touched that hidden place. They may have realized, perhaps for the first time, that what they miss isn't simply something you did. It's the way they felt when you were there. And that realization can change everything. What makes their answer even more revealing is that they may not have named something dramatic at all. They may have mentioned one tiny thing about you, something so ordinary that another person would barely understand why it mattered. Maybe they said they missed the way you used to check whether they had eaten. Maybe they missed the random messages you sent when you knew they were having a difficult day. Maybe they missed the way you remembered something they casually mentioned weeks earlier. Or maybe they simply said, "I miss talking to them." And everyone in the conversation might have heard those words as something simple, but your soulmate may have felt the weight behind them. Because sometimes what people miss isn't the action itself. They miss what that action represented. They miss being noticed. They miss being understood. They miss having someone who could recognize a change in their mood before they even explained it. They miss the comfort of knowing that somewhere in the world there was a person who genuinely cared about the small details of their life. Imagine living in a house where one particular window always lets in the morning sunlight. You never think about it while you're there. You simply wake up, see the light, and continue with your day. Then one morning you move somewhere else and realize the room feels completely different without it. Nothing dramatic happened. The house still exists. The furniture is still there. The day still begins. But something subtle is missing. That may be what your soulmate has been experiencing without fully understanding it. They may have continued living, meeting people, having conversations, laughing, working, and moving forward. Yet certain moments still feel strangely incomplete because they remind them of something they once had with you. And perhaps that is why the question affected them so strongly. It didn't ask whether they remember you. It asked what they miss. Those are completely different questions. Remembering someone can be passive. Missing someone is emotional. Missing means some part of their absence is still being felt. Your soulmate may have discovered that through the simplest memories. Maybe they miss your particular way of saying their name. Maybe they miss how you could make them laugh when they didn't feel like laughing. Maybe they miss those conversations that started with something completely meaningless and somehow ended with both of you talking about dreams, fears, childhood memories, or the future. Those moments probably didn't seem extraordinary while they were happening, but distance has a strange way of making ordinary moments precious. When someone is part of your everyday life, you don't always recognize the emotional value of their presence. You assume there will be another conversation tomorrow, Another joke, another late-night message, another opportunity to say what you didn't say today. Then circumstances change, and suddenly the smallest memories become the ones that return without permission. Your soulmate may have realized that recently, and perhaps they were surprised by which memory came to mind first. They might have expected to miss something physical or obvious, but instead they remembered the emotional atmosphere surrounding you. They remembered feeling safe enough to be imperfect. They remembered being able to speak without carefully choosing every word. They remembered the feeling of being known, and that is much harder to replace than a particular habit or routine. You can meet someone new and experience excitement. You can have interesting conversations. You can laugh with another person. But emotional familiarity develops through time, through hundreds of tiny interactions that teach two people how to understand one another. That kind of familiarity cannot simply be recreated overnight. It becomes part of your emotional memory. So when your soulmate was asked what they miss most, they may have accidentally touched that exact place. They may have realized that they don't simply miss something about you. They miss how natural everything felt when you were around. And perhaps this is why their answer carried more emotion than they expected. They were not simply remembering your presence. They were remembering a version of themselves that existed around you. Think about that for a moment. Have you ever been around someone who brought out a side of you that rarely appeared anywhere else? Maybe you became more playful, more honest, more relaxed, more ambitious, more vulnerable. Sometimes we don't just miss people. We miss who we were when we were with them. Your soulmate may be discovering that now. Maybe around you they didn't have to maintain the image they showed everyone else. They could let the mask fall for a while. They could admit uncertainty. They could talk about things they usually kept hidden. They could be quiet without the silence feeling awkward. And after the connection ended, they may have realized how rare that experience actually was. That realization can be uncomfortable because it doesn't allow them to dismiss the past as easily as they once did. If they only missed your appearance, they could tell themselves that memories fade. If they only missed a habit, they could replace it with another routine. But if what they miss is the emotional safety they felt around you, then the feeling reaches somewhere much deeper. It becomes a question of connection rather than memory. And that may be why they hesitated when answering. Perhaps they started with something simple, then paused. Maybe they changed their wording. Maybe they laughed nervously and tried to make the answer sound less serious. People often do that when they accidentally reveal something vulnerable. They say something meaningful and then immediately cover it with humor. They make the emotion smaller because acknowledging its full size feels dangerous. Your soulmate may have done exactly that. They may have said, "I guess I miss our conversations," and then quickly moved on. But what they didn't say was, "I miss having someone who understood me without making me explain everything." They may have said, "I miss their laugh," while secretly remembering how hearing that laugh made difficult days feel lighter. They may have said, "I miss how they cared," while avoiding the deeper truth that being cared for by you made them feel valued in a way they didn't fully appreciate at the time. That's the hidden language of nostalgia. The words describe the surface, but the emotion lives underneath. Imagine an iceberg floating in the ocean. What everyone sees is only a small piece above the water. Beneath it is something much larger, hidden from view. Their answer may have been the visible part. The emotion underneath could be much bigger. And perhaps they are only now beginning to understand that themselves. They may be wondering why one question affected them so much. Why did one memory return so quickly? Why did their chest feel different when they said your name? Why did they suddenly remember details they thought they had forgotten? Why did they feel the urge to know how you are doing now? Those questions matter because they suggest the memory isn't emotionally neutral. Something inside them is still responding to it. But don't confuse that with a guaranteed return. Feelings can exist without immediate action. Someone can miss you and still remain silent. Someone can care and still be afraid. Someone can regret something and still not know how to repair it. That complexity is important because real emotions are rarely as simple as "they miss you, therefore they will come back." What matters here is that the question revealed something they may have been avoiding. Their answer created a small opening in the emotional wall they built around the past. And once that opening exists, memories can begin flowing through it. They may start remembering not only what they miss, but why it mattered. They may start connecting the small details to the larger emotional experience they shared with you. And eventually, they may realize that the thing they miss most was never really one specific thing at all. It was the feeling of being deeply understood by someone who knew their heart in a way they didn't realize they needed. That is when a simple answer becomes something much more powerful. Because beneath the words, "I miss this about them," may be a truth they have never been brave enough to say. I miss the way I felt when they were part of my life. And this is where their answer may have become far more revealing than they intended. Because beneath the simple words they gave, there may have been an emotion they weren't prepared to name. Maybe they thought they were answering a harmless question about a memory, but the moment they started describing what they missed, something deeper surfaced. They weren't only remembering you, they were remembering what it felt like to have you in their world. And that distinction matters, because someone can remember a person without feeling emotionally connected to the memory anymore. But when a memory still changes the way someone speaks, pauses, smiles, or becomes quiet, there may be something underneath it that hasn't completely disappeared. Your soulmate may have tried to keep their answer casual, but perhaps their voice changed slightly. Perhaps they paused before answering. Perhaps they looked away, laughed nervously, or suddenly became more thoughtful than they expected. Those tiny reactions can sometimes reveal more than the actual sentence. Imagine a locked room that has been untouched for years. Someone opens the door expecting dust and emptiness, but instead they find everything exactly where it was left, waiting beneath the surface. That can happen with emotions too. People can put feelings away without truly resolving them. They can move forward without completely understanding what they left behind. And perhaps your soulmate has been doing exactly that. They may have continued their life, met new people, experienced new things, and convinced themselves that the emotional chapter involving you was finished. But when someone asked what they miss most about you, the question slipped past all of those defenses. Suddenly, something they had carefully placed in the background moved to the front of their mind. And maybe what appeared wasn't simply nostalgia. Maybe it was longing. Maybe it was tenderness. Maybe it was regret. Maybe it was the quiet realization that there was a part of their emotional life with you that they haven't been able to recreate. They may not even know which word fits best yet. That's what makes this so interesting. Feelings don't always arrive with labels attached. Sometimes you recognize an emotion through the way it behaves before you understand what it is. You notice that certain songs bring someone back to mind. You notice that a familiar place suddenly feels different. You notice that hearing their name still creates a reaction. You notice that a simple question about them makes you remember details you thought you had forgotten. Your soulmate may be discovering that their emotional connection to you never disappeared completely. It simply became quieter. And quiet feelings can sometimes be the most difficult to understand because there is no dramatic event forcing you to confront them. They exist beneath ordinary life, waiting for something to bring them back into focus. Perhaps that question did exactly that. Someone asked, "What do you miss most about them?" And suddenly, your soulmate had to confront a memory they usually avoid. Maybe they remembered the way you looked at them when you knew something was wrong. Maybe they remembered how you could make them laugh during a terrible day. Maybe they remembered the conversations where they told you things they had never told anyone else. And perhaps they realized something uncomfortable. Those weren't just memories of you. They were memories of emotional safety. They were memories of being accepted without having to perform. They were memories of being known. And once someone recognizes that, it becomes much harder to dismiss the connection as something ordinary. Think about the difference between missing a place and missing the feeling you had when you were there. You can revisit a location, but you can't always recreate the version of yourself that existed inside that moment. Your soulmate may be missing that version of themselves. Around you, perhaps they were softer, more open, more spontaneous. Maybe they didn't have to think so carefully before speaking. Maybe they could admit when they were afraid. Maybe they felt understood in ways they didn't fully appreciate at the time. And now, after distance has changed everything, they may be recognizing how rare that emotional environment was. This could explain why their answer revealed something they have never admitted. Because saying "I miss their laugh" feels safe. Saying "I miss who I was when I was with them" is much more vulnerable. Saying "I miss being understood by them" is even harder. And saying "part of me still wants that feeling back" requires a level of honesty that they may not yet be ready for. So perhaps they stopped themselves before reaching that final truth. Maybe they gave the safer answer, but inside they knew there was more. Imagine standing at the edge of a deep ocean and only dipping your fingers into the water. You can feel the temperature, but you haven't experienced the depth. Their answer may have been that first touch. They felt something underneath, but they didn't dive into it. And perhaps now they are thinking about the question again when nobody is around. They may be replaying their own answer and wondering why it affected them so much. Why did I think of that memory first? Why do I still remember that tiny detail? Or why did saying their name feel different? Why am I still wondering how they are? These are the kinds of questions that can slowly unravel emotional certainty. And maybe they are beginning to realize that they have been confusing silence with closure. Just because they stopped talking about you doesn't mean they stopped feeling something about you. Just because life moved forward doesn't mean every emotion from the past disappeared. Sometimes moving forward means learning how to carry certain memories without allowing them to control you. Your soulmate may be at that stage now, where the memory isn't necessarily destroying their peace, but it still has a place inside them. And perhaps that is why their answer matters. It wasn't a dramatic confession. It was something smaller, and therefore in some ways more believable. A tiny piece of truth slipped through when they weren't expecting it. They may have revealed what they miss because they were asked to name something specific, but in naming it, they accidentally exposed the emotional meaning behind it. That's the part they may not have intended anyone to see. They weren't supposed to reveal that your presence made them feel understood. They weren't supposed to reveal that certain moments still live in their memory. They weren't supposed to reveal that some part of them still wonders what it would feel like to experience that connection again. And perhaps after the conversation ended, they tried to move on as if nothing happened. But the mind doesn't always cooperate. A memory can return at the most unexpected moment. They may hear a song and remember you. They may pass a familiar place and think of a conversation. They may notice someone doing something that reminds them of one of your old habits. Suddenly the answer they gave begins echoing inside them. And the more they think about it, the more they may realize that the question didn't create the feeling. It simply exposed something that was already there. That is the difference. The question was the trigger, not the source. The emotion had been quietly existing underneath the surface. And perhaps the most surprising part is that they may finally understand why they avoided admitting it. Because acknowledging that they still miss you means acknowledging that the connection mattered more than they allowed themselves to say. It means accepting that time didn't completely erase the emotional significance of what you shared. It means admitting that some part of their heart still recognizes something familiar in your memory. And whether they ever say that openly is another story. But sometimes a person's truth appears in the smallest places. In a pause, in a memory, in a sentence that suddenly becomes quieter, in the way they answer a question they thought would be easy. And your soulmate may have just discovered that the feeling they were trying not to name has been speaking through their memories all along. What happens after someone accidentally admits something they have been trying to keep buried? Usually they don't immediately run toward the feeling. They sit with it. They question it. They try to explain it away. And that may be exactly where your soulmate is now. After answering what they miss most about you, they may have gone back to their normal routine, but something felt slightly different. The conversation ended, yet the question stayed behind. It followed them into quiet moments, into the drive home, into the late hours when distractions disappear and the mind becomes honest. They may have wondered why they couldn't simply give an ordinary answer and move on. Why did that particular memory appear? Why did they suddenly remember details they hadn't thought about in months? Why did your name still carry a certain emotional weight? And perhaps the answer they gave became a mirror they couldn't stop looking into. Imagine dropping a small stone into a perfectly still lake. The stone disappears almost immediately, but the ripples continue traveling long after it is gone. That question may have been the stone. The conversation was brief, but the emotional ripples could continue much longer. Your soulmate may begin noticing things they previously ignored. They may realize how often certain memories return. They may notice that when something good happens, a small part of them wonders whether they would have told you. When something difficult happens, they may remember how you used to make them feel understood, and that can create a strange emotional contradiction. They may be happy with their current life while still missing something about the past. They may have accepted the separation while still carrying affection. They may genuinely want to move forward while occasionally wondering what might have happened if certain things had been different. These emotions can exist at the same time. Human hearts are rarely as organized as people pretend they are. Your soulmate may also begin comparing experiences without intentionally doing so. Someone says something, and they remember how you would have responded. Someone listens, but perhaps not in the way you used to. Someone makes them laugh, but the feeling isn't exactly the same. They may not consciously sit there thinking, this person isn't like them. Instead, their mind simply notices the difference. That's how emotional memory works. It doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it quietly creates comparisons in the background. And perhaps that is what makes your soulmate's realization so unexpected. They may have believed they had moved past the connection because they weren't actively thinking about you anymore. But now they are realizing that forgetting to think about someone isn't the same as forgetting what they meant. You can stop checking someone's profile. You can stop asking mutual friends about them. You can stop talking about the relationship. You can even convince yourself that you are completely fine. Yet one small question can reveal that the emotional imprint is still there. Maybe they remembered how you used to notice when something was wrong before they said anything. Maybe they remembered a private joke that nobody else understood. Maybe they remembered the way you encouraged them when they doubted themselves. And suddenly they realize those moments weren't insignificant. They were pieces of a connection they didn't fully appreciate while they were living inside it. Think about a song you haven't heard in years. You can forget the title. You can forget when you first heard it. You can forget the circumstances surrounding it. Then the opening notes play somewhere unexpectedly, and suddenly an entire chapter of your life comes rushing back. The song didn't create those memories. It simply unlocked them. Your soulmate's question may have worked the same way. It unlocked something they had placed behind a closed door. And once that door opens, they may find themselves wondering what else is still there. They might start remembering your conversations differently. Instead of focusing only on how things ended, they may begin remembering how things felt before everything became complicated. They may revisit moments where you showed patience, kindness, or understanding that they didn't recognize at the time. Distance has a strange ability to change perspective. When people are emotionally close to a situation, they often focus on what hurts, what annoys them, or what they believe needs to change. After separation, the emotional noise becomes quieter, and sometimes the good becomes easier to see. Your soulmate may now be able to look back without the same defensiveness. They may understand things about you that they couldn't understand before. They may even realize that some of the qualities they once took for granted were actually rare. And that realization can be uncomfortable because it forces them to reconsider the story they told themselves about the separation. Perhaps they once believed they were simply moving on. Perhaps they told themselves the connection had run its course. Perhaps they convinced themselves that you would eventually become just another memory. But now one honest answer has complicated that narrative. Because if you are truly just a memory, why does remembering you still feel different? Why does one tiny detail still carry emotional weight? Why does your name still create a reaction they can't fully explain? Those questions may not have easy answers, and your soulmate may not be ready to answer them yet. They may even resist them at first. They might tell themselves they are only nostalgic. They might say everyone remembers old relationships sometimes. They might insist that missing something doesn't mean they want anything back. And technically that's true. Missing someone doesn't automatically mean reconciliation is coming, but it does mean the emotional story may not be as simple as they once believed. There is another possibility they may slowly begin confronting. Perhaps what they miss most isn't something you gave them, but the emotional freedom they experienced around you. Maybe they could be vulnerable without feeling judged. Maybe they could dream without being laughed at. Maybe they could admit their fears without feeling weak. Maybe they could simply exist without performing. And if that is what they miss, then the feeling is deeper than nostalgia. It becomes recognition. They are recognizing what the connection allowed them to experience. Imagine someone who's been walking through a crowded city for years and suddenly remembers what it felt like to stand somewhere completely quiet. They may not realize they were exhausted by the noise until they remember the silence. Your soulmate may be remembering that kind of emotional quiet. The space where they didn't have to pretend. The space where they felt seen. And perhaps that is the feeling they have never admitted, because admitting it would mean acknowledging how much your presence mattered. Maybe they never told you that you made them feel safe. Maybe they never told you that your attention to small details made them feel important. Maybe they never told you that certain conversations stayed with them longer than they admitted. People often assume the deepest feelings are the dramatic ones, but sometimes the strongest emotional bonds are built from ordinary moments repeated over time. A person remembers that you noticed, that you listened, that you remembered, that you cared. Those tiny acts become emotional fingerprints, and once someone recognizes them, they can be difficult to erase. So now your soulmate may be looking at the past with a slightly different perspective, not necessarily with regret, not necessarily with certainty, but with greater honesty. They may be asking themselves whether they truly understood what they had when they had it. They may wonder whether you knew how much certain moments meant. They may wonder whether you ever think about them too. And that last question can be especially powerful because it changes the direction of the memory. Instead of only remembering you, they begin imagining your current life. They wonder who you became, what changed, whether you're happier, whether you still remember the little things, whether you ever hear a familiar song and think of them. And perhaps, somewhere in that chain of questions, they realize something they weren't expecting. They are not simply remembering the past. They are becoming curious about the person you are now. That is where a forgotten emotion can begin transforming into something new. Not necessarily a promise, not necessarily a reunion, but a renewed awareness. The person they once knew still exists in their memory, but they may now wonder who you became after everything changed. And perhaps that curiosity is the next chapter of the feeling they thought had already disappeared. And perhaps this is the part your soulmate never expected to discover. The question about what they miss most may have started as a conversation about the past, but it quietly turned their attention toward the future. Because once someone realizes a feeling is still alive somewhere inside them, they cannot always return to the certainty they had before. They may still continue their normal life. They may still tell themselves that everything is fine. But now there is a small question sitting beneath the surface. What if that connection meant more than they understood? What if the things they dismissed as ordinary were actually the moments that mattered most? What if the person they thought they had completely moved beyond still occupies a small, protected space inside them? And perhaps that is why the memory feels different now. It is no longer simply something that happened. It has become something they are trying to understand. Imagine finding an old letter tucked inside a book, years after you thought you had forgotten the person who wrote it. You read the words again, but this time you are not the same person who first received them. The words haven't changed. You have. Suddenly, sentences that once seemed ordinary carry an entirely different meaning. Your soulmate may be experiencing something similar with their memories of you. They are looking at the past through a different version of themselves, and that changes what they see. Maybe they now understand your patience differently. Maybe they recognize the depth behind certain things you said. Maybe they realize that some of your actions were expressions of love. They were too distracted, afraid, or emotionally unavailable to recognize at the time. And this can create a quiet kind of regret. Not necessarily regret that screams for attention, but the kind that appears in a private moment and asks, "Why didn't I understand that then?" They may think about conversations where they were too defensive, moments where they misunderstood your intentions, times when you reached out emotionally and they didn't know how to respond, small opportunities they ignored because they assumed there would always be another chance. That's one of the strange things about separation. It doesn't always make people miss the relationship immediately. Sometimes it gives them enough distance to finally understand it. And perhaps your soulmate is now discovering that the smallest things they once overlooked have become the things they value most. They may remember how you listened when they were overwhelmed, how you noticed details other people ignored, how you could sense when something was wrong without demanding an explanation, how you made them feel like their thoughts mattered. Those memories can become more powerful with time, because they are attached to emotional experiences, not just events. They may even catch themselves wondering whether you remember the same moments. Did you remember that conversation? Did you remember that particular joke? Did you remember the little thing they once told you that even they had forgotten? That question can be surprisingly emotional because it creates the possibility that the connection was not one-sided in its meaning. Perhaps they wonder whether somewhere in your own life a small detail still reminds you of them. And maybe that is what makes their original answer so important. They were asked what they miss most about you, but the deeper question their heart may now be asking is, did I lose something I didn't fully appreciate? That question has no simple answer, because what is lost isn't always the person alone. Sometimes what is lost is a possibility. The possibility of who two people could have become if timing had been different, communication had been better, fear had been smaller, or circumstances had been kinder. Your soulmate may occasionally wonder about that possibility now. They may imagine how things might have unfolded if certain moments had gone differently. But here's something important. You don't need to turn their feelings into a guaranteed prediction. Their realization belongs to them. Their choices belong to them. What matters for you is understanding that the connection may have left an emotional imprint deeper than either of you recognized at the time. And perhaps the most beautiful part is that you don't have to chase that realization. You don't have to force them to admit anything. You don't need to send a message simply because you sense they may be remembering you. You don't need to prove that you were important. Some truths become stronger when they are allowed to exist without pressure. Imagine planting a seed and constantly digging it up to see whether it has grown. You would interrupt the very process you are waiting for. Sometimes emotional clarity needs space. Your soulmate may need that space to understand what the memory means to them. And you may need your own space to continue becoming the person you are meant to become. Because while they are remembering the version of you they knew, you are not standing still. You have changed. You have learned. You have grown through experiences they may know nothing about. And if they ever encounter you again, they may not simply be meeting the person they remember. They may be meeting someone shaped by everything that happened after the separation. That can make the memory even more powerful because nostalgia tends to preserve an old version of someone, while reality eventually reveals who they became. Perhaps that is why their curiosity may continue growing. They may wonder what your life looks like now, whether you are happier, whether you found the peace you were searching for, whether you still carry the same softness, whether the person who once understood them so deeply has become someone even more confident and complete. And maybe the answer to those questions is not something they can discover by thinking about the past. They would have to encounter the present. But until then, their memories may continue doing something unexpected. They may stop feeling like wounds and start feeling like reminders of something meaningful. That shift can be profound, because there is a difference between remembering someone with pain and remembering someone with gratitude. Perhaps your soulmate is slowly moving toward the second. Maybe they are beginning to appreciate what the connection taught them, what it revealed about themselves, and what they failed to recognize while they were inside it. And perhaps that is the feeling they never admitted. Not simply that they miss you, but that a part of them is grateful you existed in their life at all. They may never say that directly. They may not even fully understand it yet. But sometimes gratitude is the final layer beneath longing. You miss the person, then you miss the feeling, then you understand the meaning. And eventually, you realize that certain people change you simply by having been part of your story. Maybe that is what your soulmate is finally seeing. The tiny details they remember aren't meaningless fragments. They are evidence that the connection left a mark. A laugh, a phrase, a habit, a look, a conversation. A moment when you knew something was wrong before they said it. A detail they completely forgot about, but you somehow remembered. These are the things that survive because they were attached to emotion. And if they were asked today what they miss most about you, perhaps they would still struggle to give one perfect answer. Because the truth may be much bigger than a single memory. They may miss the way you made ordinary moments feel special. They may miss being understood without having to explain every part of themselves. They may miss the version of themselves that appeared when they felt truly seen. And perhaps, deep down, they miss knowing there was once someone who remembered the little things. So if this message resonates with you, don't let it pull you backward. Let it remind you of the value of genuine connection and the power of becoming someone whose presence leaves meaning behind. You don't need to chase a memory. You don't need to force a confession. You don't need to convince anyone of what you are worth. Sometimes the most powerful realization happens quietly, when someone finally understands the value of something only after they have lived without it. And maybe your soulmate's answer was the beginning of that realization. A simple question opened a door they thought was closed. Behind it was a memory. Behind the memory was an emotion, and behind that emotion was a truth they may have avoided for a long time.